The Ford 427 SOHC, known simply as the Cammer, was one of the most outrageous engines ever built by an American automaker. Designed to annihilate the competition in NASCAR, this overhead cam beast was Ford's secret weapon in the horsepower wars of the 1960s. However, before it ever got to prove itself, NASCAR slammed the door shut. Not because the engine wasn't legal, but because it was too good. But what exactly is the Ford Cammer, and why was NASCAR afraid of it? In the early 1960s, Detroit's automakers were locked in a brutal horsepower war, and the battleground was NASCAR. Ford, despite its engineering capabilities and racing pedigree, found itself in a tight spot. Chrysler had just unleashed the monstrous 426 Hemi, a hemispherical-headed beast that was turning tracks into Chrysler's personal playground. The Hemi was dominating the high-banked ovals, effortlessly leaving Ford's top-spec pushrod 427s in the dust. The Hemi's secret weapon was in its head design. By using hemispherical combustion chambers and large valves positioned at opposed angles, Chrysler had created an engine that breathed exceptionally well at high RPMs. Ford engineers understood that their traditional wedge head 427 couldn't match that kind of top-end efficiency. To stay in the game and to win, they had to fight fire with fire. So Ford's engineers did what few thought possible. In just 90 days, they developed an entirely new overhead camshaft design. Radical for the time and especially unusual for American V8s. They started with the familiar 427 FE side oiler block, known for its durability and strong bottom end. This provided a solid foundation, but everything above the block was transformed. The conventional pushrod valve train was ditched in favor of a single overhead camshaft per cylinder bank, operated by a long timing chain that stretched an eye-watering 6 feet in length. These were no ordinary cams either. They were massive, aggressive, and specifically tuned to make horsepower in the upper RPM range. The heads themselves were also a marvel. They featured hemispherical combustion chambers similar to the Hemis, which allowed for enormous 2.25-inch intake and 1.90-inch exhaust valves, some of the largest ever fitted to a Ford V8. The result was a tremendous increase in airflow, which translated directly into more horsepower, and the numbers were staggering. Ford rated the single-carb version at 616 horsepower at 7,000 RPM, and the dual 4-barrel setup at 657 horsepower at 7,500 RPM. Figures that were unheard of for a naturally aspirated production-based V8 in 1964. But it wasn't the peak horsepower that made the Cammer special. The engine was built to withstand extreme abuse. It featured forged internals, cross-bolted main caps, a high-capacity dry sump oiling system, and heavy-duty valve train components designed to survive the punishing conditions of endurance racing. Engineers even tested the Cammer on dynos for extended periods at 7,000 RPM, and the engine didn't just survive, it thrived. According to insiders, the engine could make well over 700 horsepower in race trim with tuning and open headers, giving it a terrifying edge over anything else on the track. Ford knew they'd built a monster. It was more than just a match for the Hemi. It was, in many ways, a superior design, both in power and in technological sophistication. The Cammer was ready to change everything. Ford prepared to debut it in the 1965 NASCAR season with a goal of reclaiming dominance in America's premier racing series. But just as fast as the Cammer had been developed, it would be snatched away from the competition, banned before it could ever run a lap in anger. NASCAR decided to ban the Ford Cammer not for technical reasons. It was purely political, personal, and rooted in a power struggle that had been brewing beneath the surface for years. To understand the ban, you have to understand the context. NASCAR in the early 1960s was a tightly controlled, family-run operation. Bill France Sr., the founder and iron-fisted ruler of NASCAR, wasn't just the face of the sport, he was the sport. Every rule change, every manufacturer deal, every major decision flowed through him. He was deeply invested in keeping the sport fair and competitive, but more importantly, he wanted to make sure no single manufacturer got too much power. When Chrysler introduced the 426 Hemi in 1964, it was clear they were playing to win. Their new engine was miles ahead of the competition, and it showed. Suddenly, Hemi-powered cars were dominating NASCAR events, racking up wins and leaving Ford and GM scrambling to respond. Bill France had initially allowed the Hemi under the stock car ethos, but its clear racing pedigree raised eyebrows. This wasn't just an evolution, it was a revolution, and it made the field lopsided almost overnight. Ford's counterpunch was swift, but unlike Hemi, which had at least a token appearance in some Chrysler street cars, the Camry was purely a racing engine. It was never intended for mass production, and Ford had no plans to put it in showroom models in significant volume. That's where NASCAR drew the line. In late 1964, just as Ford was prepping its SOHC-powered cars for the 1965 season, NASCAR announced a rule change that effectively banned exotic engines. The new rule required all engines to be production-based, with a minimum number of units available to the general public. The Camry, with its niche production and expensive high-performance parts, didn't meet the criteria. NASCAR officials declared it ineligible before it ever turned a competitive lap. Officially, it was about keeping the sport accessible and rooted in real-world cars. Unofficially, it was power politics. Bill France had a long-standing tension with the automakers, especially when he felt they were building cars that threatened to upset his control over the sport. The Camry wasn't just a powerful engine. It was a symbol of Ford challenging the status quo, pushing technology so far that it threatened to widen the gap between factory-backed teams and independents. France wasn't going to let that happen. Chrysler had already experienced similar friction. In protest of the Hemi ban, they pulled their factory teams from the 1965 NASCAR season entirely, sitting out on major events. Ford considered doing the same, but ultimately decided to stick it out using their older pushrod-based 427s. What stung the most was the inconsistency. By 1966, NASCAR allowed the 426 Hemi back in, on the condition that Chrysler produce a certain number of street-legal Hemi-powered cars. Ford, however, wasn't given the same flexibility with the Camry. They could have homologated it, built 500 or 1,000 street cars with the SOHC engine, but they chose not to. The cost was high, the logistics complex, and the policies dicey. Ford decided not to play that game, and the Camry was effectively locked out of NASCAR forever. It's worth noting that Ford did run the Camry in limited events under sanctioning bodies that weren't beholden to NASCAR's rules, most notably the AHRA in select match races, but the big show, the Grand National Series, remained off limits. When NASCAR slammed the door on the 427 SOHC, Ford was left holding a caged lion. They had spent millions developing a world-class racing engine that wasn't allowed to compete in the arena it was designed for. But in classic hot rod fashion, they didn't scrap it. They unleashed it somewhere else. That somewhere else was the drag strip, where rules were looser, competition was wilder, and sheer power was king. The National Hot Rod Association, NHRA, had long been the playground for American ingenuity and brute force engineering. Here, the Camry found its true calling. Unlike NASCAR, the NHRA wasn't interested in limiting innovation as long as it followed safety guidelines. That meant Ford's overhead cam beast could run wide open, and it didn't take long for it to make its presence known. Ford began supplying the 427 SOHC to top-tier drag racers across the country, and almost overnight, the Camry became a dominant force in top fuel and funny car classes. In fact, the engine was so powerful and reliable at high RPMs that it quickly earned a reputation as the Hemi killer. In the right hands and with the right tuning, the Cammer could crank out well over 700 horsepower naturally aspirated. And with supercharging, some versions exceeded 1,000 horsepower on nitromethane blends. For its time, that was utterly insane. Drag racing legends like Connie Kalitta, Dyno Don Nicholson, and Pete Robinson took the Cammer into the spotlight. Kalitta, in particular, famously piloted SOHC-powered rails that terrorized the quarter mile throughout the late 60s. In match races and national events, Cammers were often faster than their Hemi counterparts, especially on tracks that allowed full-throttle launches with minimal traction loss. The long-stroke, high-revving nature of the engine made it ideal for the short bursts of speed required in drag racing, and its overhead cam design offered more precise timing at extreme RPMs than the old pushrod setups. But the Cammer wasn't just about straight-line performance. It was a technical showpiece. Enthusiasts were drawn to its alien appearance, towering cam covers, massive chain drive, and that unmistakable mechanical whine at idle. Even among the wildest creations in the drag world, the Cammer stood out. In a sea of big blocks and modified Hemis, the SOHC Ford looked and sounded like it belonged in a different era or a different planet. Ford supported these efforts semi-officially, often providing engines, parts, and technical backing, though they never pursued NHRA competition as aggressively as Chrysler. Still, the results spoke for themselves. The Cammer racked up wins, records, and legendary passes that would become the stuff of drag racing folklore. It also inspired countless backyard builders, many of whom started stuffing SOHC mills into everything from roadsters to altered wheelbase gassers. Unfortunately, as the 1970s wore on, the Cammer's dominance began to wane. Not because it wasn't competitive, but because it was expensive and complicated to maintain. The 6-foot-long timing chain, while ingenious, was a nightmare for regular tuning. Parts were costly, and the engine didn't share much with standard FE motors. Meanwhile, Chrysler's 426 Hemi became the NHRA's gold standard thanks to huge factory support and widespread parts availability. Eventually, rules and technology shifted towards standardized platforms, and the Cammer faded from top-level competition. But it never disappeared. To this day, Cammer-powered dragsters occasionally appear at nostalgia events, where fans still gather around the pits just to see one fire up. When it does, the sound is unmistakable. Sharp, high-pitched, and angry, like a wasp the size of a Buick. In the end, the drag strip saved the Cammer's legacy. It never got to wear the NASCAR crown, but in the world of quarter-mile warfare, it earned something arguably more lasting: fear, respect, and a permanent place in muscle car legend. Don't stop following us. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel for more of our videos. See you in the next one.